everyone, and welcome to Achieving Success with Olivia Atkin. I'm your host, Olivia Atkin. Each week, we will discuss the roadmap of achieving your personal and professional success. In these solo episodes, I pull back the curtain on podcasting, entrepreneurship, and personal success. You'll hear the strategies I use, the lessons I've learned, and the honest stories that shaped me. So you can build not just a successful podcast, but business and life you're proud of. Today's episode is a little different. Today, we're going to talk about something that I believe the podcasting industry doesn't talk about enough. And that is the parts of podcasting people don't like to admit. If you spend time in the podcasting world, whether you are a host, a consultant, a producer, or someone considering starting a podcast, you will hear a lot of conversations about things like growth, strategies, download numbers, monetization tactics, and marketing systems. And those conversations matter. Do not get me wrong, they matter a lot. But they only tell you part of the whole story. Because behind every podcast episode is something much, much deeper. Behind every microphone is a person navigating a journey that is far more complex than most people realize. Podcasting is not just content creation. Podcasting is vulnerability. Podcasting is leadership. Podcasting is responsibility. Podcasting is growth. And sometimes podcasting is even uncertainty. There are moments in the podcasting journey that many hosts experience privately, but rarely say out loud publicly. Moments where they reflect, moments where they question, moments where they realize that the platform they're building carries more weight than they initially expected. And today I want to talk about those exact moments. Not because podcasting is negative. Oh, trust me, it is not. In fact, I believe podcasting is one of the most powerful platforms we have for connection and impact. But because when we talk about the realities of building something meaningful, we help other people approach that journey with clarity and confidence. So today we're going to explore the parts of podcasting people don't like to admit, but they should be proud to talk about. And for each one, we're going to talk about three things: why it happens, what it means, and how to approach it in a way that strengthens your podcast, your mindset, and your impact. Because awareness alone isn't enough. But awareness combined with intention, that's where transformation happens. So podcasting is more vulnerable than most people expect. When people first think about starting a podcast, they often focus on the exciting parts of it, the conversations they'll have, the ideas they want to share, the guests they hope to interview, the audience they want to reach. But what many people don't expect is how vulnerable podcasting can feel. Because podcasting is voice, and voice carries something deeply personal: your tone, your energy, your curiosity, your emotions, your perspective. When someone listens to your podcast, they're not just consuming information, they're experiencing you. They're experiencing how you think. They're hearing how you respond to ideas. They're hearing how you navigate conversations. And that creates a level of intimacy that many other platforms simply don't have. But intimacy requires vulnerability. There are moments when podcast hosts finish recording an episode and quietly think, did that conversation land the way I hoped it would? Did I ask the right questions? Did I communicate that idea clearly? Will listeners understand what I was trying to say? And I have been there. I've asked all those questions myself in different points of recording different episodes. Those thoughts don't come from insecurity. They come from caring. They come from recognizing that words have impact, that conversations matter, that voice carries influence. And when you host a podcast, you are stepping into a role where your voice has reach. Sometimes you know who you're speaking to, sometimes you don't. But someone out there is in fact listening, and that awareness can feel vulnerable. But here's the truth that many experienced hosts eventually realize. Vulnerability is not a weakness in podcasting. It's one of the greatest strengths we have because listeners don't connect with perfection. They connect with authenticity. They connect with curiosity. They connect with hosts who are willing to explore ideas openly rather than pretending to have all the answers. Some of the most powerful and meaningful podcast conversations happen when a host is willing to say things like, I'm still learning about this, or I'm curious about this perspective, or I hadn't thought about it in that way before. Those are things I say in real time because I'm having a conversation with someone, and that is honestly how I feel. It creates a space for discoverability and discovery. It reminds the listeners that podcasting is not about performance. It's about conversation. If vulnerability shows up for you as a podcast host, here are a few things to remember. First, reconnect with your purpose. Ask yourself, why did I start this podcast? What conversations matter enough that I'm willing to share them? Who might benefit from hearing this discussion? Second, focus on intention rather than perfection. No episode will ever be perfect. And I remember back when I started my podcast, my amazing producer, Ben, who is on this very recording that we're recording right now, and he's been on every single one of the episodes I've ever recorded. We recorded the first one, and I was like, was that good enough? Was that perfect? What do I need to improve on? And that vulnerability alone of being able to ask someone else, like, hey, what do I need to improve on, opens the door for real conversations. And Ben gave me honest feedback about, hey, slow down a little bit, or, your lighting could be better. Little things that also made me realize that no matter how many times I did it, or how many times I thought maybe that wasn't good enough, it was really good. And it was just small tweaks, but also I got to a point where Ben and I had a conversation, and he's like, no matter what you do, it'll never be perfect. And that was a handful of episodes in because he wanted me to understand the fact that, like, hey, don't try to be this person, this persona, be you, because that is what's keeping him engaged, that's keeping the guest engaged, that's keeping the listeners engaged, and it's more fun that way. But if your intentions is to create meaningful conversations, that intention will come through even when you're not perfect. It will shine through more when you're not perfect. And third, remember that authenticity builds trust, and trust is the foundation of every great episode. The responsibility of having a platform. One of the things, and I would say biggest things people don't talk about enough in podcasting is responsibility. Because when you host a podcast, you are creating a platform. And platforms carry influence, even if your audience is small. And I don't want to say even, because I always say, and you've heard me say it again, I'd rather have 50 listeners who listen the entire time and will actually convert and enjoy the conversation and refer the podcast to people that will help than 1,000 people who listen for 4 minutes and then log off. And they couldn't tell you for a moment what the actual podcast episode was about. And even if you're just starting, the moment your voice enters someone else's headphones, you have the potential to shape how they think about a topic, how they approach a challenge, how they interpret an idea. That doesn't mean podcast hosts need to feel pressure to be perfect. Again, I have embodied not being perfect, and it has freed me so much to really show up in the best way as a host. and for my guests and for the listeners. But it does mean recognizing that conversations matter, words matter, questions matter. The way we frame discussions matters. Podcasting has the power to introduce people to new ideas, new perspectives, and new ways of thinking. And with that power comes responsibility. Responsibility to approach conversations thoughtfully. Responsibility to listen deeply to guests. Responsibility to create dialogue that is honest, respectful, and meaningful. One of the things I believe strongly about podcasting is that it's not just about broadcasting ideas. It is about facilitating conversations. And good conversations require curiosity. They require openness. They require a willingness to explore complexity rather than simplifying everything into a quick answer. If you host a podcast, here are a few ways to approach the responsibility of the platform you're building. First, prepare for conversations. Research your topics. Understand the context behind the discussions. Second, approach interviews with curiosity rather than assumptions. Ask questions that invite depth. And third, remember that your platform is an opportunity to create conversations that help people think more deeply, not just react more quickly. That distinction really does matter. I also want to talk about podcast growth is slower than many people expect. And I think that is a big myth within the podcasting space. And another truth that many people don't say out loud is that in fact, podcast growth is often slower than is what is expressed on social media or that is expected. Online, you'll see a lot of messaging around rapid audience growth. Launch your podcast and grow quickly, get thousands of downloads, monetize in months. But the reality for many podcasts is much different. Podcasting is not just content distribution. It is relationship building, and relationships take time. Listeners invite your voice into their lives, into their commute, into their workout, into moments when they are reflecting on their future. Trust builds gradually, episode by episode, conversation by conversation. And sometimes growth happens quietly. You may not see it immediately in the numbers, but people are listening. People are thinking. People are absorbing the ideas you are sharing. And sometimes the most meaningful impact happens long before the numbers reflect it. This is something many experienced podcasters eventually realize. Podcasting is not a sprint. It is a long-term platform, and long-term platform for connection, a long-term platform for authority, a long-term platform for impact. If growth feels slower than expected, try shifting your perspective. Instead of asking, how fast is my podcast growing? Ask, what kind of conversations am I creating? What kind of trust am I building with my audience? What kind of value am I delivering through these discussions? Because depth of connection often matters far more than the speed of growth. The invisible work behind podcasting. One of the realities of podcasting that listeners almost never see is how much work happens behind the scenes. When someone listens to a podcast episode, they hear a conversation. Maybe it's 30-minute discussion. Maybe it's 45 minutes. Maybe it's an hour-long deep dive into a topic or a discussion. And whether it's a solo episode like this, an interview, a roundtable that people might do, you are recording. And you are recording for that time and being very intentional with that time. But what they're hearing is the final product, not the entire process. Behind the conversation are hours of preparation between researching topics, preparing questions, scheduling the guest, coordinating calendars, recording, editing, uploading, writing descriptions, creating promotional content, publishing across multiple platforms, and managing all of the details that make the podcast possible. Much of that work is invisible to the listener. The listeners don't see it. They will never see it. And that's the point. You don't want them to see the back end work to it. They don't see the late evenings spent editing audio, which I will say the caveat to this is there are a lot of people who, when they start their podcast or even years in, do edit their own audio and video. That takes hours of time. If there's one thing I can recommend to everyone today, whether you're thinking about starting, you've started in early in or years in, hire an editor and or a producer. It will save you so much time and stress. I've had Ben on, and I hired Ben prior to my first episode recording, and the horror stories I have heard from hosts who are trying to do that piece alone by themselves is a stress I've never had to deal with. And it's technology I've never had to deal with. So definitely recommend, instead of spending the late nights editing audio and video, hire an awesome producer and or editor. They don't see the time spent preparing for interviews. They don't see the planning that happens behind the scenes. And that can sometimes make podcasting feel heavier than people expect. Not because the work is negative, but because it requires more commitment than many people initially realize. And this is one of the reasons so many podcasts stop after a small number of episodes have been released or even recorded. There's times the hosts record a handful and then go to edit it, write their titles, descriptions, all the things, and never end up releasing them. Not because the host lacked passion, but because they underestimated the amount of work required to sustain the platform itself and sustain the podcast in an impactful way. And sustaining something meaningful always requires effort. But here's the important part. Invisible work is not wasted work. Invisible work is foundation work. I'm going to repeat that again. Invisible work is not wasted work. Invisible work is foundation work. I hope that hit home for you just like it hits home for me. It's the preparation that makes meaningful conversations possible. It's the structure that allows creativity to exist. And it's the discipline that turns a podcast from an idea into a platform. If the invisible workload of podcasting feels overwhelming at times, or even just sounds overwhelming, here are a few ways to approach it. First, create systems. Batch record episodes when possible. I always try to batch record episodes, especially because I joke, a woman got to do her hair, her makeup, all the things before hitting record. So definitely batch episodes. Also, that will help you in not having to stress about, do I have time to record this week and that episode needs to be released this week, or a guest canceled because they're sick, or something happened in my family or the guest family and now we don't have time to record, we're not going to have an episode. Batching eliminates that. Schedule interviews in clusters. Use tools that streamline editing and publishing. Second, plan your content in advance. Having a roadmap of upcoming episodes removes a lot of stress. And third, remember why the work matters. The invisible hours you spend preparing are what allow the visible conversations to exist. And those conversations can reach people in ways many may never fully see. Comparison in the podcast industry and another truth that many podcasters experience but rarely talk about openly is comparison. Podcasting is a public platform, and anytime something is public, comparison can appear. You might see another podcast gaining visibility, another host landing a high-profile guest, another show growing quickly. And it's natural for the mind to start asking questions like, how did they grow so fast? How did they land that opportunity? What are they doing that I'm not doing? These thoughts are human, But comparison can become distracting if we allow it to shift our focus away from our own purpose, because every podcast exists within its own context. Different audiences, different goals, different strategies, different timelines. Some podcasts are built for entertainment. Some are built for education. Some are built for community. Some are built as extensions of businesses. Comparing two podcasts without understanding their context is like comparing two completely different journeys. And when we get caught up in comparison, we sometimes forget something important. The reason we started the podcast and you started your own podcast in the first place. Your voice is not meant to replicate someone else's platform. Your voice exists because your perspective is unique. Your experiences are unique. Your conversations are unique. If comparison begins to show up in your journey, try this. First, acknowledge it without judgment. It's natural. Second, shift the perspective. Instead of asking, why are they ahead? Ask, what can I learn from their approach? And third, refocus on your mission. Your podcast exists for a reason, and staying anchored in that reason keeps comparison from being a distraction. The pressure to keep showing up. Podcasting requires consistency, and consistency requires commitment. When you build a podcast, you're building an expectation with your audience. Listeners begin to anticipate your episodes. They build habits around listening. And that consistency is one of the reasons podcasts create such strong relationships with their audiences. But consistency also creates pressure. There may be weeks where recording feels effortless, and there may be weeks where it feels more challenging. Life happens, schedules change, energies just sometimes shifts. Unexpected events occur. And yet many podcast hosts still feel the responsibility to show up, to deliver the next episode, to continue the conversation. That pressure can sometimes feel heavy, but it also reflects something important. Podcasting is a commitment to a conversation, a commitment to consistency, a commitment to showing up for your audience. But consistency does not mean perfection. And consistency does not mean ignoring your own well-being. One of the heaviest ways to approach podcast consistency is through one of the healthiest ways, not heaviest. See, no one is perfect. One of the healthiest ways to approach podcast consistency is through preparation. Create a buffer of episodes. Record content ahead of time. Plan your podcast calendar several weeks or months in advance. This creates flexibility when life becomes unpredictable. Podcasting should support your life, not overwhelm it. And the most sustainable podcasts are built with intention, not exhaustion. Again, this is one of the healthiest habits in running my podcast and doing my podcast for so long that I adapted very quickly. I came in with this intention and the mindset of getting ahead of episodes before I even knew what it meant. And I see most podcast hosts not doing this. The top podcasts, those globally ranked ones, they typically do, but everyone beneath at the top 10% most listened to podcasts globally really do not. And it creates a realm and a higher likely that it will become an unhealthy habit for you and an unhealthy hobby or work you're doing that will get you sick, that will get you frustrated, that won't help your mental mindset. Because being able to put even just the calendar that I mentioned above, I've mentioned a few times so far, the creating a buffer of episodes and record content ahead of time. But the calendar alone, lay out your calendar based on your podcast strategy. What kind of episodes do you need? What do you still need, right? You could be months into recording in your recording year, be like, oh, I still need X amount of episodes with this type of guest or X amount of episodes on this content. Now you know where to focus your time. Also, if you don't want to record, for example, the week of Christmas and New Year's or over the summer, or you're going to be moving this year and you know that's coming up and you're not going to have time to record right before that, during that, and right after that, having that calendar laid out of what you need to do so that, and like the time that is absolutely a no-go in your schedule will help you then figure out how many episodes you need to buffer. What is your recording content time? Where should that fall to make you ahead? And so that is one of the best things that I have implemented from the very beginning in helping me be present, not just in my podcast, but also in business and life, because I'm never stressed out about recording or when to record or will I have enough episodes and so on and so forth. And podcasting changes the host. And this is something that very few people talk about, but podcasting just doesn't just impact the audience. It impacts the host. It has definitely impacted me. When you have meaningful conversations week after week, something interesting happens. You grow. Every guest introduces new perspectives. Every conversation invites deeper thinking. Every topic encourages reflection. Over time, podcasting becomes more than a platform. It becomes a learning experience. It becomes a space where curiosity expands, where perspectives shifts, where understanding deepens. Hosts often begin their podcast thinking they will primarily be teaching or sharing insights, but many eventually realize that they are also learning alongside the audience. Podcasting becomes a mirror of reflecting growth, reflection, and discovery. And that transformation can be one of the most rewarding parts of the entire journey because meaningful conversations change people, including the person asking the questions. Allow the podcast to shape your thinking. Approach each conversation with curiosity. Stay open to the perspectives that challenge your assumptions. Growth is one of the greatest gifts podcasting offers. And the more curious you remain, the more powerful your conversations become. And downloads are often misunderstood. One of the most common questions people ask about podcasting is about downloads. I get this question all day, every day. How many downloads does your podcast get? What's considered a good download number? How do I grow my downloads faster? Downloads have become one of the most visible metrics in podcasting, and metrics can be helpful. They can provide insight. They can show you trends. They can help hosts understand where their content is really reaching and resonating with people. But one of the things that people don't talk enough about is that downloads do not tell the full story of impact. Someone can listen to one podcast episode at the exact moment they needed to hear it. One conversation might give someone the courage to pursue a new opportunity. One idea might change how someone approaches their whole career, their relationship, or their mindset. And those moments will never show up in download statistics. Podcasting is different from many other content platforms. A social media post might be seen quickly and then forgotten, but podcasts often stay with people. Listeners spend 30 minutes, 45 minutes, sometimes an hour or more listening to conversations. They absorb the ideas. They reflect on them. They sometimes revisit episodes later. Podcast impact is often quiet. It's not always visible. And because of that, it's easy for hosts to underestimate how meaningful their work might be for someone else. Another important reality is that many podcast hosts compare their download numbers without understanding what the industry benchmarks are. A podcast with a few hundred dedicated listeners can actually be performing really well, especially if those listeners are deeply engaged, especially if those listeners trust the host, because trust is where the real power of podcasting lives. Trust leads to influence. Influence leads to opportunity. Opportunity leads to growth. Instead of focusing on download numbers, consider asking yourself a different question. Are my listeners engaged? Are people reaching out about episodes? Are conversations resonating? Am I creating discussions that make people think differently? Downloads are a metric, but impact is the real goal. Monetization advice is often very oversimplified. Another truth that people don't always talk about is that monetization advice in the podcasting industry can sometimes be oversimplified. Many people believe that sponsorships are the primary way podcasts make their money. You'll hear messaging like, once you grow your podcast, sponsors will just come in. And sponsorships can absolutely be a part of a podcast monetization strategy, but they are only one piece of a much larger picture. Podcasting is not just a revenue stream. Podcasting is a platform, and platforms create opportunities far beyond advertisements. For example, podcasts can build authority. They can position hosts as thought leaders. They can create relationships with guests who later become collaborators, clients, partners. They can open doors to speaking engagements. They can strengthen business credibility. They can deepen audience trust. In many cases, the most valuable outcome of podcasting is not sponsorship income. It is influence, because influence creates opportunities in ways that are far more sustainable than short-term advertising deals. If you're thinking about monetization, ask yourself, how does my podcast support my larger mission? How does it strengthen my relationships? How does it position me within my industry? When a podcast becomes part of a broader ecosystem, business, leadership, community, its value multiplies. And listener messages carry emotional weight. One of the most powerful experiences many podcast hosts have is hearing from listeners. Sometimes someone sends a message saying an episode helped them. Sometimes someone shares that a conversation shifted how they think about a challenge. Sometimes someone says they felt understood while listening. And those moments carry emotional weight because the podcast hosts often record episodes without knowing who or when someone will hear them. You sit behind a microphone, you have a conversation, you publish an episode, and then it enters the world. But when someone reaches out to say that your podcast made a difference in their life, it reminds you that these conversations matter. It reminds you that your voice can reach people across distance, across industries, across experiences. And those messages often become some of the most meaningful moments in the entire podcast journey. If you receive messages from listeners, save them, not for ego, but for perspective. Those reminders can be incredibly powerful during moments when growth feels slow or uncertain, because they remind you that impact is real, even when it's quiet. The difficult conversations with guests. Another reality that many podcast hosts experience is navigating difficult conversations. Not every topic is simple. Not every story is easy. Some conversations involve complex perspectives. Some involve emotional experiences. Some involve disagreement or nuance. And hosting those conversations requires thoughtfulness. It requires listening. It requires the ability to create a space for dialogue without forcing conclusions. And that can feel challenging, but it is also one of the reasons podcasting is such a powerful medium. But podcasting allows conversations that are deeper than headlines, longer than short form content, more reflective than quick reaction. When hosts approach difficult conversations with curiosity and respect, they create opportunities for understanding. And understanding is something the world always needs more of. When hosting complex discussions, listen deeply, ask thoughtful questions, avoid rushing towards a simple answer. And remember that the goal of the conversation is not always agreement. Sometimes the goal is understanding. Why many podcasts disappear after 20 episodes. And one of the realities of podcasting is that many shows stop early. Sometimes after 3 episodes, sometimes after 10, sometimes after 20, sometimes after a few months. This doesn't happen because the host lacked talent or lacked passion. Often it happens because The initial excitement fades when the long-term commitment becomes clear. Podcasting requires consistency, preparation, planning, and patience. Without systems and purpose, it becomes difficult to sustain, but podcasts that continue often share something in common. The host approached podcasting as a long-term platform rather than a short-term project. They create systems, they build habits, they focus on meaningful conversations rather than quick results. If you want your podcast to last, create systems that support consistency, plan content ahead of time, and treat your podcast like a long-term investment in your voice and in your community. Podcasting is really actually a leadership platform. One of the things I believe strongest about podcasting, and something that people in the industry don't always say out loud, is that podcasting is not just a content platform. It's a leadership platform. When you host a podcast, you are not simply producing episodes. You are creating conversations. You are asking questions. You are introducing ideas, and you are shaping how people think about topics that really do matter. And that is leadership. Leadership does not always look like standing on stage. Sometimes leadership looks like sitting behind a microphone and asking thoughtful questions. Sometimes leadership looks like creating space for voices that deserve to be heard. Sometimes leadership looks like having the courage to explore conversations that are meaningful, complex, or challenging. Podcasting invites people into dialogue, and dialogue is one of the most powerful tools for growth. When listeners hear thoughtful conversations, they begin to think differently. They reflect. They consider new perspectives. They challenge assumptions. And that act of encouraging deeper thinking is leadership. But leadership often requires intention, requires recognizing that conversations carry influence. It requires understanding that the tone of a discussion can shape how people interpret ideas. It requires being thoughtful about how questions are framed. And it requires being open to learning alongside your audience. The most powerful podcast hosts are not the ones who pretend to have all the answers. They are the ones who remain curious. They remain thoughtful. They remain open to discovery, because curiosity invites deeper conversation, and deeper conversations create meaningful connection. If you host a podcast, here are a few ways to approach it as a leadership platform. First, approach the conversation with curiosity rather than certainty. Ask questions that explore the ideas instead of simply reinforcing opinions. Second, think intentionally about the kind of conversations your podcast brings into the world. Are they thoughtful? Are they constructive? Are they meaningful? And third, recognize that leadership often happens quietly. You may never see the full impact of a conversation, but that does not mean the impact isn't real. And why podcasting is still one of the most powerful platforms we have, after everything we've talked about today, the vulnerability, the invisible work, the slow growth, the pressure, the responsibility, there's one truth that remains clear. Podcasting is still one of the most powerful platforms we have for connection, because podcasting creates something that many other forms of content struggle to create: attention. When someone listens to a podcast, they are giving you their time, their focus, their curiosity. And in a world filled with constant noise, attention is incredibly valuable. Podcasting also creates depth. Unlike quick posts or short clips, podcast conversations allow ideas to unfold. They allow nuance. They allow reflection. They allow people to hear not just conclusions, but the thought process behind them. And that depth builds trust. Trust is what transforms a podcast from content into community. Trust is what allows listeners to return episode after episode after episode. Trust is what allows conversations to have lasting influence. Podcasting also creates connection. Even if listeners never meet the host, even if they never send you a message, even if they simply listen quietly week after week, a relationship is forming, one built through voice, through curiosity, through shared exploration of ideas. And those relationships can be incredibly meaningful. Podcasting also has something else that many platforms don't: longevity. A podcast episode can exist for years. Someone might not discover it. Someone might discover it months later or years later. And the conversation still matters. The ideas still resonate. The kind of longevity makes podcasting uniquely powerful. Because conversations do not disappear quickly, they remain accessible. They continue to reach people long after they were recorded. And when we continue all of these elements, and when we combine all of these elements, voice, trust, curiosity, longevity, podcasting becomes much more than content creation. It becomes an impact platform, an influence platform, a leadership platform. And that is why, despite the challenges we've discussed today, podcasting remains one of the most meaningful ways to share ideas with the world. Before we close today's episode, I want to leave you with a few questions to reflect on, not as a checklist, but as an invitation. If you host a podcast, ask yourself, what conversations do I want my podcast to create? What ideas do I want people to think about after listening? What impact do I hope these discussions will have over time? Because podcasting is not just about producing episodes. It's about creating conversations that matter, conversations that encourage curiosity, conversations that invite growth, conversations that remind people they are not alone in their experiences. And when podcasting is approached with that intention, something powerful happens. The podcast becomes more than a show. It becomes a space where ideas are explored, where perspectives are shared, where listeners feel connected to something larger than themselves. And spaces like that matter. If this episode resonated with you, I want to hear from you. Not just the polished version of your story, but the honest one. Your moments of uncertainty, your moments of courage, your moments of authenticity. Let's keep the conversation going. You can reach out to me directly through the links in the description or at olivia.atkin@achieving-success.com. And if you're ready to grow your podcast, your business, or your personal brand through real strategy and genuine connection, not hustle, not noise, not performance, then I would love to work together. Because when you lead with connection, you don't just grow your numbers, you grow trust, you grow influence, and you grow impact. I'm Olivia Atkin, and this is Achieving Success with Olivia Atkin. Until next time, stay curious, stay human, and stay connected.